2017 St. Gallen Wings of Excellence Award Session. Breaking the status quo. What is your disruptive idea? Around 1,000 students from across the globe have submitted their disruptive ideas to solve problems of great magnitude. Today, we will put the 6 very best entries to the test. In this session, we give them the stage to present their ideas to a panel of international leaders. They will challenge what has been submitted on paper. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the host of the session, Riz Khan.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, all the students here as well who have put so much effort to make this work, thank you very much for having me again as your host. I still have lots of bad jokes to share, so you'll probably regret it and not invite me next year. But I'm very honored to be the MC for this. Welcome to one of our newer features here at the St. Gallen Symposium, one where we terrify and grill, here they are. 6 students who've managed to reach the lofty heights of the finals of the St. Gallen Wings of Excellence Award. It's interesting, we've been discussing disruption and all kinds of things at this conference. I was at a session just now moderating one earlier on artificial intelligence, and I told the people who attended there, one of the best expressions I heard recently was, artificial intelligence has absolutely nothing on natural stupidity. And I come across a lot of that in some of the work that I do. But it's interesting because we're seeing technology merging. And you probably know about the idea that we'll get to a stage where YouTube, Spotify, Twitter, and Facebook will all merge to form You Spotty Twitface, or something like that. So, but I think back to a time where now we've been talking about the cell phones we carry, mini computers in our pockets, and I was thinking back to a time when the first time I had a mobile phone, a cell phone, I was at the BBC, sent out on a report into London, and given this brick of a battery that weighed, I think, about 7 or 8 kilos at least, with a telephone attached with a cord, and I had to walk around trying to find even 1 bar of signal in central London to see if I could make a call back to the TV station to do this live. And I heard a story at that time of a guy who was sitting on a train in the London Underground on the tube. And he sat next to a guy who was fiddling with a watch, which had it was bulky and it had a bit of a screen. And he was intrigued watching this because, of course, in those days, a watch was just a watch. So he kept looking at this thing and watching the guy fiddling with it. And finally, he couldn't resist. He said, what are you doing? He said, I'm an inventor. I'm a technologist. And I've created this watch. It's got all kinds of unique features. It actually has a telephone in it, a TV in it, and everything, which, of course, everyone's going, wow. He said, that's amazing. It's amazing. I love that. He said, yeah, it's a prototype, but, I'm doing. He says, listen, I really want one of those. He says, well, it's not ready yet. No, I want this. I want this. Come on, I'll pay you anything you want for this. The guy said, I've only got a couple of these. I'm working on them. He said, look, you've got a couple. Let me buy one. I'll write you a check right now, £10,000. A lot of money in those days. And the guy said, he said, seriously, here? And he wrote the check out. And the guy said, all right. And he unclipped it. And the guy put on the watch, and he was really happy. And his station arrived, and he got up to walk away. And the guy said, wait, you want this? And handed him a heavy suitcase. He said, what's that? He says, well, that's a power pack. So we have come quite a long way. Anyway, here at St. Gallen, we are tapping into the natural intelligence here with the students who've come through the essay competition. More than 25,000 ideas have been submitted over the years since 1989, when it all began, from across the globe. And this year, almost 1,000 graduates and postgraduate students from 350 universities in 70 countries have written an essay on the question, breaking the status quo, what's your disruptive idea? And they were asked to come up with a solution to a problem of greater magnitude in the field of business, politics, science, or society. But this solution had to be centered on the idea of disruption and a disruptive idea. So the selection process, almost 1,000 excellent submissions, tough to say the least, right through to 6. And we have the 6 sitting with us now. I'm always quick to point out, though we end up having a first, second, and third place, which you'll find out tomorrow, nothing really should be taken away from the standard of this competition. It's quite phenomenal. And it's a very, very high standard, global standard as well. So the purpose of this session is not to judge the 6 finalists. The actual voting is done with a professional jury that closely examines all the aspects of the essay submitted. The twist we've put on here is we've decided to think about it from more than just the essay competition itself, but see what it means, how they cope under the pressure of having to explain their ideas over 3 minutes and then be grilled and defend their idea over 10 minutes with an expert panel, whom I shall announce in just a moment. So I've told them to enjoy their time up here and present their ideas to you and the expert panel, and really try to get across these disruptive ideas they've had. Let me introduce the panel, starting with ladies first. In the middle we have Robyn Meredith, who escaped the world of journalism and has worked with the New York Times, Bloomberg Television in Hong Kong. She was also the Hong Kong bureau chief and foreign correspondent with Forbes. She does something highly secretive now, I'm sure, but I know that she's an expert analyzing the region, the Asia region where she lives, and has written about it in The Elephant and the Dragon, The Rise of India and China, and What It Means for All of Us. So buy it and read it if you don't want to be caught out by Asia's ongoing disruption of the withering Western supremacy. With us also is Thebe Ikalafeng, who's a returning expert known for his work in Africa, his expertise specializing in brand strategy and intellectual property management for some of the world's leading firms. He's the founder and group CEO of Brand Leadership, his company in South Africa. Great to have you back as well, Thebe. Stephan Chambers is also back with us. Nice to see you back as well, Stephan. He's director at the Marshall Institute for Philanthropy and Social Entrepreneurship at the London School of Economics. And apart from being a long-time supporter of the St. Gallen Symposium, he's also the founder of Oxford University's Executive MBA, which he was directing for a number of years. So again, let me emphasize, the expert panel is not here to judge, simply to explore the ideas that have been put forward and on what are these 6 highly judged disruptive ideas that could have an impact on the world. So we'll get to the results tomorrow of the final 3, but for now, let's meet the 6 finalists who've made it through to the initial judging. I'd say almost 1,000 essays, down to basically about 19 for 100, and then 19, and now to this collection of Super 6. So I'm going to leave the stage, and you'll have an introduction to each one, and then we'll get on with grilling each one, I guess. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Martin Foote. I'm from Australia and I'm studying a Master of Applied Economics at Monash University. So I worked in Mongolia for a year. Apart from working very hard for the Mongolian government, it was a very memorable year because we got to spend a lot of time outdoors, horse riding, hiking, going camping. Disruption is going to change the way that we live our lives and run our businesses. And now more than ever, it's important for young people to get involved because it's going to affect our future lives and our livelihoods.
Right, good evening. So at the St. Gallen Symposium, we've talked a lot about disruption, and yet it still seems that there are some fields of human endeavour that are just simply undisruptible. One of these is government. And if you're an innovator sitting in the audience today, this is a major problem for at least 2 reasons. One is that mishaps and misconduct inevitably lead to new regulations that presume to make our lives safer, but also raise the bar for future innovation. The second problem is more existential. Across the world, trust in the institutions of government and faith in democracy are on the decline. We like to believe that if we elect better leaders, we'll get better government. But what if the problem is actually rooted in the way that our underlying political systems are themselves designed? Consider this: the US government has shut down 18 times since 1976. Italy has had 65 governments in the past 70 years. What CEO here is going to make investments with a long-term payoff when their government can't even promise that it can keep the lights on? So the way I've proposed to tackle this problem is the way that entrepreneurs have been toppling stagnant industries for many decades, and that is to start afresh. I think governments should empower small autonomous regions, which I've playfully dubbed startup nations, to act as experimental political incubators. So these startup nations would be able to try different combinations of laws, freedoms, even constitutions. And is this a crazy idea? Maybe, but there's a little bit of legal precedent. For instance, in the UK, they have 3 Crown dependency islands, which each have their own courts and elected parliaments. Australia's Norfolk Island is similar. It has its own separate systems of taxation and social security. And perhaps the most interesting example for this essay is Puerto Rico. America's Congress has actually authorized Puerto Ricans to draft their own internal constitution, which in effect makes the island self-governing. But many of these examples are basically just quirks of history or the remnants of a colonial legacy. What most governments today lack is a genuine mechanism to experiment, to fail, and to renew themselves, which is the very essence of modern disruption. So John Maynard Keynes once said, and I'm quoting him here, "The difficulty lies not so much in developing new ideas as in escaping from old ones." I think what we need today is to lower the barriers to entry for government innovation, and I think startup nations are the way to do it. Thank you for your time.
So Martin, now 10 minutes. We have our expert panel, and I'm going to open it up if anyone has an opening question. I'll leave it to you. Maybe Robyn, you want to start?
Sure, Martin, congratulations for going first. That's tough.
Thanks, Robyn.
I want to go back to what your main idea of these startup nations. Does it require people to have the ability to move in and out of them? Because it strikes me that if the startup nation succeeds in its experiments, that's great. But if the startup nation fails in its experiments, then the people who are in it might be trapped there, and that would be, a real problem for them.
Yeah, definitely. So the way I envisioned it is that there would be freedom of migration between the startup nation and its parent states. And in fact, that would be an important guiding principle for the way that these are designed, because that freedom of movement would allow citizens and also corporations to reallocate and express their preferences for government regulation in that way. So it would also give each individual startup nation, you could have multiple at any one time, it would give each nation a strong incentive to offer, sound governance and regulation.
Couldn't you do that in a local government effectively already? I mean, in Australia, you might have a city or a state that has different regulations, just as you might in the United States. California's regulations are very different, say, from Wisconsin's. Yeah,
right. You can, and I think in places like Australia and the United States, that tension, that competitive federalism is actually a very important part of the way that these countries were initially designed. And in the United States, the states have actually been leaders on so many important reforms dating back to women's rights to vote and the abolition of slavery and so on. But ultimately, there are limitations on what they can do. They will always be constrained by the national constitution. And I think my idea would be to go beyond that and actually allow these constituent startup nations to have their own separate constitutions as well.
Right, Thebe?
Martin, I'm a bit disrupted by your idea.
Sure.
I think that's the point.
Because that experiment where you come from, what's it called? Australia.
It is called Australia.
That's an ex-prison, right? What is it? It seems to have worked out quite fine, and it seems to be quite an over-regulated country. Are you trying to escape regulation? Because was that trip from Mongolia quite good for you? So you need to have a bit of freedom, right? And not be in such a regulated country.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I think, the idea is to trial and experiment with different laws, legal frameworks, political systems, constitutions. So you could theoretically have some startup nations that are less regulated, and you could see if that works more effectively. It wouldn't necessarily be the case that they'd all have to be that way.
So what's so disruptive about your idea?
So I think, so in my essay, I kind of set out some of the precursors to this idea. And actually, one of them was mentioned today with the micronation and the president of that micronation speaking earlier. My idea is a bit different in that, those micronations is usually people who are frustrated by their government and they want to set up shop somewhere else. Whereas I'm actually proposing that governments need to be in the business of disrupting themselves. So they need to set up these startup nations to trial, like I said, different forms of governance and different political systems and see what works and what doesn't.
Stephan, are you feeling disrupted?
Yeah, I mean, first, congratulations on a very clear presentation. I
Thanks.
very much like the shortness of the words and the crispness of the sentences. And I've got two questions, really.
Sure.
The first one is, it always worries me when someone starts a sentence with government should, okay? Especially if they're in the business of disrupting government. And 2/3 of the way through, and I'm quoting you now, you said government should set up a series of experimental, as it were, skunk work nations.
Right.
So that's my first comment stroke question is, how do you reconcile what you're trying to do with the fact that it has to get done by the very institutions about whom you disapprove? And then the second one is a little bit like Robyn's question. So off the back of your diagnosis, which is that there is a kind of sclerotic apparatus, that most of the challenges that the world faces are supranational or don't fit in the old nation model. What most people do is they move to the next best agglomeration, which is called the city.
Right.
Okay, with more than half the world living in cities. City innovation, city governance is most people who've worried about this for a long time, is their bet on where this goes. So, guess two questions. One, how do you reconcile the government should sentence? And two, why did you rule out the city, which remember has more than half the world's population in it, unlike a micronation, which would have a small handful of people in it? Why do you rule that out?
Okay. All right. So to answer your first question, government should. I don't dispute that this would be a tough sell, and ultimately, politics is the art of the possible. So it would take a lot of courage and a lot of convincing to get this idea off the ground. I say governments should because, fundamentally, I think it's just. If you have, even if you're an individual, if you're a corporation, if you're a company, if you're a government, you should always be thinking about, the threats on the horizon, and ways to improve yourself. I don't know if that answers your question, but maybe.
Partially.
Okay. And all right, the second question was about cities, and I think so these startup nations probably they would start off in small regions, so they would almost certainly be cities to start off with. So in my essay, I go through some of the alternative kind of competing ideas. So for instance, city-states have been, a part of our political history for the past 2,000 or 3,000 years. And we also see modern city-states like Singapore that seem to function very well. So certainly you could trial these startup nations as cities, and there would be no objections to that. At the moment, though, it's almost, I'd give a similar response to Robyn's question earlier about the states, in that most cities today, while they are leaders in areas like climate change and so on, they're ultimately still constrained by the national laws and the national constitutions.
If you run an experiment in a small place and it seems to be working,
Yep.
you've then got to run it in a big place.
Right.
Okay? So it's not clear that anything that you do at a very micro level would be commensurate at a macro level. So you're back at the same level that you were when you started.
Micro level. I'm not sure. I mean, so like I mentioned earlier, definitely national governments have always drawn, inspiration from their constituent territories, and it's always been the case that cities and states have experimented with different political systems, and those have filtered upwards to the national government. So I think that there are some issues and some policies that would be difficult to scale downwards and upwards. But I think that equally that there's a lot of innovative political systems that we see today that could also be trialled at a city level and at a national level.
Time for you. Just a couple of minutes left, so very quickly, please, Thebe.
I'll take issue with the one comment you just did. Did you say politics is the art of the possible?
Yes.
Last week I was reading the paper and a minister from Zimbabwe said, we get into politics to make money. So So I'm worried. So it's the other possible one, the possibility of making money. I'm sure Trump will agree with that as well, right? But I'll tell you my real question or my real worry with your disruptive, non-disruptive idea is you've quoted Puerto Rico, they went broke last week. You've quoted Hong Kong, China's taken them back. You've quoted Cook Island, they're a tax haven for crooks. So how could you use those as good examples of what we should be following, Martin?
So I wasn't using them as examples of startup nations. The point I was trying to make is that you might think that these nations are completely impractical, but there's already legal mechanisms and international legal precedent for these to appear. So with Puerto Rico, the point I was trying to make is that there's actually a special clause in the US Constitution that allows the US Congress to refrain from applying the Constitution itself to Puerto Rico. And that allows Puerto Rico to experiment with a different constitution.
And they broke.
Yes, and they broke. So the idea with these startup nations is that you have to have a process of experimentation, and like all startup ecosystems, you're always going to expect some failures and some successes. But if you try enough times, then you're going to get, I think you'll find some interesting data.
Right. Martin, thank you very much. Well done. Thank you. And so on to our next finalist.
My name is Benjamin Hoffman. I'm a PhD candidate and a research assistant in international affairs at the University of St. Gallen. I was born in communist Eastern Germany, and so the life-defining moment for me was actually the fall of the Berlin Wall, which enabled me to live in a free world. I love traveling to remote places in Northern Europe, for instance. I think it's important to talk about disruption, because what we are experiencing now is the disruption of the liberal world, which we should avoid.
So, come on.
Good evening. I wouldn't be here today without liberalism. Now, ladies and gentlemen, how would your life look like in an illiberal world? I'm asking this question at a time when global liberalism is seriously under pressure. Protectionists are attacking free trade. Authoritarian forces are threatening our liberal democratic institutions, and nationalists are undermining regional integration. This decline of liberalism will make the world less prosperous and less secure. Protectionism will trigger trade wars and economic recession. And nationalist authoritarianism will fuel armed conflict. To avoid this unpleasant return of history, we need to understand why liberalism is in crisis. I argue that the present governance of globalization is inappropriate. Globalization is a mixed blessing. Adaptive communities benefit, while others are unable or unwilling to adapt. Global spaces, such as Silicon Valley or Zurich, contrast with less adaptive communities in the US Rust Belt or in Appenzell, just a few kilometers from here. This divide gives rise to clashing values and political stances. So liberalism is mostly supported in the adaptive communities, while it is often opposed in the less adaptive communities. The nation state is not really able to accommodate these heterogeneous preferences, and global governance has not been more responsive. To cure liberalism, I argue that we need to develop smaller, more flexible, and more responsive governance structures. Inspired by the historic role model of the Hanseatic League, I call them global Hansas. Global Hansas connect globalized cities and regions to develop joint policies on collective challenges. So California, New York, London, Zurich, Flanders, Cape Town, Bangalore, Tokyo, and others would jointly govern digitalization, education, and social cohesion. Later on, also energy, migration, or trade and services. In exchange for this freedom, they would share part of their gains with less adaptive communities in their vicinity. Global Hansas are democratic, they are overlapping and competing. This most liberal form of governance will be able to restore public support, for political and economic liberalism. It will also create local identities that will be able to replace the old nationalisms. Thank you.
So 10 minutes of questioning now. Benjamin, we have 10 minutes. Anyone want to kick off in this particular? Stephan, you want to start with this? Or?
So I completely buy the analysis that says there is a kind of two-speed globalization, you know, what some people call somewheres and anywheres. And I understand that what you're proposing is to accelerate the fast track of globalization and to allocate to that responsibility for doing a bunch of clever and important things. What I don't understand is what happens to the slow track, okay? Because if the problem is that there are somewheres and anywheres, and you accelerate the anywheres, what happens to the somewheres?
I think that's the key question that concerns my proposal, because I was asked this question throughout the last 2 days, I think 4 or 5 times at least, right? Now, the thing is, you're right. I wanted to create a kind of a possibility for those who support liberalism and want to go further, right, to create this opportunity that they can move faster. Now, what happens to those that are not included, right, that are less adaptive? I think we should also give them an opportunity, right? There are a number of political forces, parties that claim they have solutions, right? That they can find a model outside of this fast liberalization and globalization to deal with the problems. Shouldn't we give them a fair opportunity to do that? And in my model, we give them resources, right, that are needed to develop own models. I mean, if you go to Appenzell, it's not necessary, right, that they participate in every kind of thing of liberalization, globalization. They might find a niche, right? And out of the niche might also emerge new initiatives, right? And my model does not preclude also the change from a less adaptive community to become one of these more adaptive ones, right?
But isn't one of the things that we know, I mean, we don't, you know, I'm a great believer that we don't know much, that most of the things we know turn out not to be as simple as we think. But I think one of the things that we know is if you design solutions for people without them being part of the solutions don't work.
Yeah, but that's exactly my idea, right? I mean, I'm not saying these less adaptive communities, they have to do this and that and that. They just need this policy, and then you will be adaptive, and then you will manage. Okay. You just give them the competence to do that, right? And you also give them, those who want more liberalization, the competence to do it. After all, it remains a democratic enterprise, right? If you don't have a majority for these policies, it will not happen, right? Okay.
Let me get on to Robyn here.
How do you incentivize these winner communities, the ones that did adapt, that have benefited? How do you incentivize them to share the gains that they get? That strikes me as difficult.
I don't think that there will be an incentive. It will more be a deal, right? The word of the deal is really popular at the moment. There's a deal maker somewhere. But it needs to be a deal. Why? Because usually they don't have the legal competencies, right, to decide on these issues that I just mentioned, or only in to a limited extent. So you devolve competencies to these cities or regions that want them, but, well, they have to give something in return, right? And I think they should share part of their gains. But still, they will be better off in the end, I think.
But how is that different from the sort of current traditional governments we have, which, you know, do in many countries have safety nets to try to support these loser communities that Stephan was talking about and that you have talked about? If you can't force the winners to share the gains, then I'm not sure how it's a better system than the current system. Can you enlighten us more? Tell me more about your idea.
Well, no, maybe you misunderstood me. I'm actually, we should force them to share part of their gains, right? Mm-hmm. Otherwise, they will not get the competencies, right? So that's part of the deal, right? Mm-hmm. And apart from that, what's new? If we talk about global integration, then the current approach has been this kind of European Union approach, right? Or Mercosur or ASEAN or whatever. And we have come to a point where we do not make any more progress, it seems to me. So maybe the solution is not to continue with this kind of nation-state integration, but move to an integration of cities and regions, subnational entities. And I think that's the new part. And it somehow connects, right, to the idea we just discussed beforehand. it just adds on that this connection across borders, right? This transnational element.
Thebe.
Benjamin, I'm so excited to hear that because of liberalism, without liberalism, you wouldn't have been here. So nobody forced your parents for you to get here, right? So that's a good start. So, but I'll tell you what, I've got a small worry. You're from Germany, right?
Yeah, from communist Eastern Germany. I was born in GDR, right? That's why I said
I tried to Google this global Hanses business, and I couldn't find it in any other language but in German. So I figured this must be a German idea. And now, if you think about Madame Merkel, who's been the strong lady of Europe, who's been supporting Greece because they don't want to pay taxes, they put it under the BRICS, and the Germans are not happy about that idea. Nobody's going to buy your idea because even the Brits have left because you want to slap with $100 billion to force them to pay for somebody else's problems. Nobody's going to buy your idea.
Wow. I guess, though, it's not a purely German idea. The Hanse, the traditional Hanseatic League, right, has been a union of trade towns in Northern Europe, spanning from Bergen in Norway to Visby in Sweden, and to the Baltics, also to the Netherlands. So I think you can still criticize it as a Eurocentric idea, and I agree, right? To some extent, it's Eurocentric. But you might also find maybe less institutionalized kind of collaborations in history. If you think about the Swahili coast in Eastern Africa, you also had these kind of merchant cities that sort of had a very intense trade. So to some extent, you might find other examples in history as well. By the way, most of you are, I think, have a corporate background, right? And you might think, well, the guy is talking about politics, so let's leave this to politicians, right? That's fair enough. However, I have to tell you that the traditional Hanseatic League was not created by politicians, right? It was merchants, commercial people, right, that went first. It's them who created the Hanseatic League, actually.
But I'll tell you what I'm worried about. I'm worried that you are now trying to propagate or to create more stronger nations which are going to suppress the smaller nations. Because that's exactly what's going to happen. Because only Germany and Britain and France maybe are going to be strong, and then they're going to have these other little countries run around as puppies.
You mean like that the new...
Just when your Hanse's idea works pretty well, because what you're going to get out of Greece? I mean, because think about it, not all countries are equal, and not all countries actually have equal competencies, or if you will, they have equal comparative advantages. Other countries simply just have a hand. They just want to be helped. And the strong countries typically take advantage of them.
You know, it's not necessarily, in this model, it's pretty flexible. So you could also imagine it as a model for South-South cooperation, if you want so, right? It's not a thing that is exclusively for the rich nations or the rich states or the rich cities. So there's an element here. And then what you can also think about, if we think about development aid, right? You could also
but don't go to development aid, because you know what is done to the rest of the world, right?
just to mention, because I talked about the devolution of competencies, right? You could also think about devolving part of the competence to engage in development policy to these new leagues, and then they would take on board cities and regions from developing countries, for instance.
Okay, but Thebe, let's get to the crux of it. I think that we could all concur you need a better name. Startup Nation, that's a good name. But Global Hanses, it just doesn't trip off the tongue.
You can't even find it on Google. It's not even good enough for Google.
That's where you commercial people come in, right? So you can help me on this, I think.
But I don't want to be a startup nation, just want to tell you. Because startups always have to listen and depend on some big brother somewhere.
Benjamin, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And that takes us to our third finalist.
My name's Declan Murray. I'm originally from the northwest of England. I'm currently studying for a PhD in international development at the University of Edinburgh. I really enjoy being outside, whether that's on my bike, running, walking, swimming, just anything that gets me kind of outside into the countryside. I think disruption can radically alter the way that we structure our economies and our societies, and perhaps take power and resources to areas and regions that currently haven't had it. Sometime in February last year, Purity walked into an electronic repair clinic in Kenya's Rift Valley, where I was training as an apprentice. She was a little distressed because her solar lantern had broken, and so she had reverted to using a dirty, dangerous old kerosene one. After a quick diagnosis, Wilson, my boss and mentor, decided that all this product needed was a new battery. The problem? No such batteries were available. Purity would have to dispose of her lantern. When I visited Purity at home a few days later, she showed me this blackened patch of grass on the ground. She'd already burnt the solar lantern. Over the last 10 years, small-scale, standalone solar power has taken off across Africa. 221 million people previously living without access to electricity are now able to watch TV, charge their mobile phone, and light their homes in the evenings. But this new market is not only novel because of the hardware, but because of new and innovative avenues of distribution. The Western companies that are kind of really driving this market are doing so through prolonged payment plans to finance consumer purchase. Before, if one of Purity's household appliances had broken, she would have taken it to Wilson and Wilson would have fixed it. Now, solar companies are designing their products to be irreparable in order to protect warranty and IP. In the process, they're squeezing the repair businesses like Wilson's. My solution, based on 18 months observing and talking to hundreds of people like Purity and Wilson, is a business that will provide replacement components to support the independent repair networks across sub-Saharan Africa. Enter Solar Spares. Solar Spares is a company that will supply solar retailers with spare components and then alert nearby repair clinics as to where those components are available. For too long, the status quo has been these universalizing ideas of business, forcing African economies to become more like Western ones. My disruptive idea is, rather than eradicate existing entrepreneurship in countries like Kenya, we should enhance and extend it. We're too late for Purity. We're not too late for 221 million other people. Thank you.
Well done, Declan. Let's see how you fare against the experts. Anyone want to kick off here? Robyn, you interested?
Sure.
First question.
Very interesting idea, but can you help enlighten me on how this might be expanded? Because it strikes me as, just getting repair parts for this particular industry may not be enough to keep these repair shops in business. Is there enough business for that? And sort of development economists have talked about these bottom of the pyramid ideas for businesses that are generated in poorer communities. They'll have a better idea of what they need than, of course, we in the West would have. Can you sort of tell us more about why you think that this business is big enough to support the owners of the shops?
So it might help if I give a bit more background to how these businesses work, at least in the context of Eastern Africa. These are small shops, and they're repairing your TV, your radio, your mobile phone, anything else. So what I'm just proposing is what we've got is a new breed or genre or type of product that isn't fitting with that model because of the way it's being sold and financed and designed. Samsung TVs are available in Kenya, but Samsung aren't present in Kenya selling them and financing them. And people are able to get either genuine Samsung replacement parts or generics that are compatible, whereas that's not currently the case with these solar products. So the businesses will carry on, but my concern perhaps is that what is increasingly happening is these solar companies are also providing the appliances, and those appliances are only compatible. So I'm just talking now mainly about the battery to begin with, let's say. But a few years down the line, when the TV that you've got came from the company as well, if that's subscribing to the same kind of design criteria or concerns, then that's when we're going to, so I feel like if we take action now on the solar stuff to accompany the existing business, then a few years down the line, maybe, and one thing I see for solar spares, if this kind of takes off, is we could partner with the existing solar companies. At the moment, they're basically trying to establish market share. They're looking at each other, not so much at, well, they are looking at the customer, but, so these people could, there's no reason why they couldn't become employed by the companies in the future or partner with them in a more official way.
Well, I'm worried. You said it's too late for purity, but I'm worried whether you are the one who's late. Because if you go across the continent, or even the rest of the world, fortunately I've been to over 100 cities around the world, so I've looked at this even other than Africa. And these ideas of repairs exist, Declan. There's nothing new about the idea. But also what worries me about it is you started off by saying the manufacturers make the products irreplaceable. So what are you replacing?
So for purity, I guess I said I was too late because she'd already burnt that product when I'd gone to see her, right? So if she's going to get a solar lantern again, she's got to save and pay the $10 or sign up for a new payment plan for a bigger product. So that's what I meant about her being too late. As for me being late to the existing businesses of repair, I think it links to my answer to Robyn that this is just like one product range within that business. And the reason that I think we could target it is you've got so many people. Like, the reason that Purity had to get rid of that product is because she'd voided the warranty by taking it to Wilson. But she didn't know that because she'd been given it by a friend as a gift. So there's these kind of concerns. These companies are coming in with certain ideas of how warranties and things should work. But somehow, somewhere along the way, there's a breakdown that Purity doesn't understand that that product, although it looks and seems the same as all our other electronics, actually needs to be dealt with in a different way.
So, but then it doesn't require a repairs, then it requires education on warranties and all those, because you say, because isn't that really the solution?
It could do, and that would definitely be a big kind of backlash I would get in this from my contacts at the various solar companies. And they're finding this education element very challenging. But for me, I'm asking, and my disruption, I guess, is why should it be that way around? Why should the companies not have to adopt to a kind of more Kenyan way of doing business?
Well, my disruption was, I looked at the top 10 waste producers. Number 1, US. Number 2, Russia. Number 3, Japan. Number 4, Germany. Number 5, UK. I can't find Africa anyway. Why are you going to us, Declan? Why don't you start with your country, which is number 5?
So with the the other reason I think I wasn't pushing the education element is because I'm looking at this from a kind of social and environmental perspective, whereby it's better to keep that product lasting longer rather than produce a whole new one for whatever we're doing in China, and then also for the battery and the plastic that Purity's let seep into the ground, and then also the finances that she's had to spend again. So as for why Kenya and not the UK, we don't have much sunshine in the UK. So.
I knew there was a reason.
So I very much like your storytelling, and I very much like the fact that you made an effort to impose some kind of modesty on your solution. You didn't say, I know the answer, these people should use my answer. So I like that very much. The question I have is that almost everything that we know about the emergence of markets like this is that the secondary market, the spares market, or the replacement market, or the repair market, has to be built into the supply chain for the primary market, which is the solar lamp, or the debt instrument, or whatever thing it is. So why would it not be a whole lot more efficient to go and talk to Off-Grid or to Mcopa Solar or whoever it is and say, we would like to be the information and supply resource for the pieces in your equipment that goes wrong. Since they're not going to stop doing what they're doing, they have enormous market traction. You're not going to turn yourself into a manufacturer.
Great question and great knowledge on some of the brands that I'm talking about. Mcopa are actually doing a lot of their own repairs as it is, so maybe I should put them to one side for a moment, but the other brands you're talking about, this would definitely apply to. And I think maybe it's what I was trying to say earlier about, I don't see this as being like a business that would take off and grow and grow and grow. I see this more as like a temporary thing. Right now, it's not the priority of these businesses. They're trying to get people aware of these technologies, get them out there, get investment in the company, and all of these kind of things. So I feel like there's just this window of, is already happening, but I imagine it's going to continue for the next couple of years, where we are getting waste thrown away. It might not be as much waste as we have in the UK, but it's still waste. And unlike in the UK, it's going to end up, in the rivers that people are using for their food and their drinking and that kind of thing. So it's a temporary thing, and I'd love to have those conversations with those companies.
One more, Robyn? No?
What kind of a business is it that is set up for temporary? Because business always talk about going concern, and here you are, you're going to set up a business. So if this idea gets taken up within 6 months, that's it. You're out of business. You have to come up with a new idea.
I think it's the kind of business that's realistic, and maybe it's modest, and maybe it's not about generating profit, but about protecting consumers and protecting the environment. And if that gets taken up by those companies, fine, I'll move on and look at another sector. So.
One more, maybe. We've got 1 minute, so we'll let Stephan squeeze in one more.
Am I allowed a quick supplementary question?
Please.
So where I think disruption is interesting is when the target of disruption is some unjust equilibrium. And what you seem to be saying is that these people who think they're doing important work, who are in many cases local as opposed to foreign, whether they are the right or a big enough target for disruption, there are unjust equilibria all around that question of who's on the grid, who's off the grid, who finances equipment, how, and so on. I think probably I would counsel to be more ambitious in your attempt to define what the equilibrium is you want to shift, and then go after that. I think your target is just very slightly off, I would say.
Okay.
It's time to save the world, Stephan.
Of course it's time to save the world.
He's trying to save the world. He's a good man. We need you.
I didn't say he wasn't a good man.
Good.
Perhaps we can talk afterwards, Stephen.
Bring your checkbook. Bring your checkbook. Declan, thank you so much. Well done. Now on to finalist number 4.
Hi, my name is Sijin. I'm from South Sudan, and I attend the University of Southern California. I'm studying film and television production. I really like to travel, and that actually probably stems from reading at an early age. Reading and books were kind of my first introduction into a completely different world, and so traveling now is kind of an exciting way to meet people and delve into the shoes of other people. It's important to talk about disruption because it's essentially inevitable. It touches all facets of life, and regardless on if you want to engage with it, it affects all of us in some way or another. 2016 was truly a year of disruption. We can see that in the exciting revival of technologies like virtual reality and augmented reality, but we can also see it in the wave of political movements, which are now turning favor towards populist movements all around the world. Certainly, there are a myriad of reasons to explain what Samuel Huntington might call this clash of civilizations. In my view, I think that we need to start at the very base of cognitive formation and analyze our learning methods. Education has a huge role in how we define ourselves and relate to each other through nationalization, through the histories that we teach to our pupils or decide to not teach to our pupils, etc. My idea looks to use VR as a platform where we can develop our learning and, by extension, understanding amidst the abundance of biased information that we receive daily. By constructing what I call strategic virtual task simulations, SVTS, that provoke interaction with real-world issues, we might wire our societies to become more empathetic through experiential contextualization. So imagine, for example, as an NGO worker entering into a refugee camp in Syria or South Sudan. On a policy level, perhaps this unfiltered virtual engagement may be crucial in uncovering less obvious, but still very important needs that call for investment. For example, how do people move around in these camps? What sort of cultural influences might aid in proactive livelihood for residents? Perhaps through a lived simulation of such a journey, mission workers may be able to mediate the leverage of middlemen transporters to provide an alternative solution for migration. So this is just an example targeting ineffective top-down policymaking, which international institutions tend to suffer from. I think that we need to strategically push the psychophysiological resource of virtual reality to reimagine our methods of learning in and outside of the institution of education. SVTS can be the leading application in revolutionizing education all around the world. So let's use the resource of VR in conjunction with the generational resource of young people who are already wired for technological innovation. As an ultimate outcome, we might encode nuanced, contextualized understandings of our own realities and the realities of others, which we can garner real-world solutions for. Thanks.
Let's see how disruptive our experts find it. Stephan, do you want to start with this one?
Thank you. I think I followed what you were saying, but let me just test whether I followed what. And forgive me if I'm slow here.
Sure.
Virtual reality as a platform technology to allow people to experience simulations of things which otherwise they would have to visit in real life. The net positive effect of which would that they would have deeper understanding of the way things were for people who weren't them.
Yes.
Have I got that right?
Yeah.
Okay, if my summary is right, why did this not work when we did Gutenberg and radio and TV and the internet and experiential learning and?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the age that we're in right now. It's no longer looking at a screen. We're fully immersed in an experience that wires not only, your psychological experience, but also your physical. I can give you an example that may. Oh, go ahead.
But reality wires your experience. And it's not clear that there's any evidence that exposure to more reality makes people any better on the dimensions that you describe.
There is research precisely on this, actually. So I'll give you an example. For environmental sort of behaviors, what has happened is simulations have been created for people to embody certain animals, right? And so they enter in these simulations, and you are essentially like a bird in an oil spill. And what has happened is people exit out of the experience, and they show attitudes that are much more pro-environmental. They recycle. They track kind of their carbon footprint. And so I think maybe your question is more towards what's new with this technology?
No, I mean, what you've just told me is incredibly illuminating. If what you've just said is true, then your opening pitch is, if people can put themselves in the circumstances of someone or something else, it has a clear and direct outcome in terms of their behaviors or preferences or that's your first sentence, in my view.
Well, you've said it more eloquently than I have then.
Thebe?
You know, before the session, I went out into the little area there and I put on that virtual reality thing from ABB. And as you can imagine, what I saw does not exist. It's somebody's imagination. So I'm worried this idea of you using virtual reality is whether you're actually trying to dupe people by creating alternate realities that don't exist. That's one side. But the second side of it is, this is an expensive business. We'll never be able to afford that. That's why you see there's very few people using VR.
Yeah, I mean, I think they made this argument, though, when computers were coming out in the 80s and 90s, and even in the 70s, right? I think it's actually a really good question, Thebe, and so I guess I'll give you an example of how I see this application being actually much more cost-effective. So in the United States, an average field trip costs about $15 USD to send one student, for a school to send one student to a museum or a park or whatever. There are companies right now that are licensing their software and hardware for $6 USD per student, and they're offering 1,000 plus virtual field trips. So, I mean, I think that's pretty incredible. And you know, there's other software as well that, you know, licenses virtual libraries, which actually gives access to schools that might not be able to afford to print and reprint every single year textbooks. So certainly it'll be expensive at the beginning, but and there's going to be a level of privatization. But as we've seen, you know, companies and businesses, they diversify their products. And I don't know if you can walk in the United States into any classroom right now and ask who does not have a cell phone, right? Like everybody has one. So I think at the beginning it'll be very, very expensive, but you know, hopefully it'll be less.
But I was more intrigued towards, you know, when I'm reading your abstract and it talks about using VR towards problems and conflicts that seem far from us. Now, you are originally from SS, South Sudan. Has been going on for years. How's virtual reality going to solve a real problem like that?
Well, you know, the example that I used was in the refugee camps. So there are a few ways that you can actually simulate an experience that can translate into actual policy. What I see, particularly from institutions like the United Nations or other international institutions, is that we're making policy and standardized frameworks and trying to apply them into places that we've never really been to before. And so this application allows you to enter into the experience through 3 different ways, actually. You can do it completely computer-generated. The second way is to pre-capture and sort of get an understanding of maybe, for example, these camps. And the third way, which I think we have technology for right now, is to actually interact with refugees. If you're in New York or you're in Paris, and you can say, what are you doing today? Are you going to get water? Can I follow you? And I think that's a really incredible resource that we have, and I think you can create policy out of that through more nuanced, contextualized information.
But Sajjan, that sounds so beautiful to say. I mean, let's use old models, CNN. We see that stuff every day. There's no better reality than a camera showing what happens in South Sudan, or what happens in Mali, or what happens in many of those countries. I simply don't see how VR is going to help solve those problems. Let me see what you're doing today. Let's go fetch water today. How's that going to solve the problem?
I think it's being able to provide an experience that we might not otherwise have, right?
Can anybody experience what you went through?
That's what I'm arguing.
VR can never, I guess my point is VR could never replicate that.
I think that there are ways, I mean, there's research that shows that these types of you know, the type of connectivity that we have when we're using technology that uses both our mind and our body, allows us to feel something that is simulated, right? So if you put on a VR headset right now, and you're standing on top of a mountain, you have a physical reaction to that, and that's incredibly powerful in encoding a simulated experience. And maybe it's not going to be exactly perfect. I can't become you, but that's where we're headed towards, and I think that can be incredibly powerful in actually, developing policy and really encoding learning.
And technology is certainly shifting in that direction. Robyn, I want to squeeze in some questions here.
Yeah, just quickly, what strikes me about this, I buy that she has research we don't have, But who exactly are you trying to help by this? Because what you've talked about eloquently is about educating people who are seeing new worlds they wouldn't otherwise experience. The refugee camp is a great example. But I'm pretty sure if you ask somebody who lived in the refugee camp or an aid worker who works with them, number one, they would be quite clear on what the problems were. And number two, the main problem would be like, I need food and water. Mm-hmm. So how would showing basically rich people or educated people a better view of what's actually happening in the world do good to the people who need the help?
Well, yeah, I mean, from my understanding, when we are trying to implement some policies in refugee camps, we'll stick with that example, the way that you get your information is through research or through talking with particular people. And I think that's incredibly effective. But the three ways that I mentioned, I think can also be ways that you can really develop policy before you go into a situation that you're sort of unsure about, if it makes sense.
On a light note, in December, January, I tried to summit Aconcagua. And I tell you, it looked amazing on virtual reality before as I was training. But I tell you, when I got to 5,200, the real reality kicked in. And that exciting feeling of summiting on virtual reality didn't kick in. But I'm sure you'll figure it out as well.
Okay.
We want to thank you, Suzanne. Thank you so much. So we're 2/3 of the way through on to our fifth finalist.
I'm Marcus, I'm from Germany. I study international affairs in St. Gallen, right now writing my master thesis.
Yay!
So when I was in Korea, I went ice fishing, and it was mediocre success, I would say.
That's a tiny one.
I really want to be out of the nature. I'm doing obstacle mud runs, cross-country running, things like that. I think in a way disruption is what defines humanity, because humans, they always strive to be better, find new ways of inventing things. We wouldn't be here without fire or the wheel or steam. So I think this is basically, one could say, what defines humanity.
So we shot this video just last Friday, just around the corner, and at some point I was standing knee-deep in snow, and kind of makes you think, is this still normal at the end of April, or is this already climate change at work? So I would like to put a new perspective on a topic that we covered this morning already. It's how to disrupt the financial sector. How, or what is my idea? It's developing a 2-degree benchmark for financed emissions, and thus creating the missing link between investment decisions and climate change. Now, why is that important? With great investments comes not only great return in the best case, but also great responsibility. Investments are key to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. So what's the current status right now? Governments are increasing regulation on the climate friendliness of investments. Within the next 3 years, advanced economies want to mobilize $100 billion per year to tackle climate change in developing countries. Customers are becoming increasingly aware of the impact that their investments have. Yet, at the same time, traditional investment strategies support a global warming of 4 to 6 degrees. So what's the core issue here? It's basically that the individual investor is not yet effectively linked to global climate goals. And that's exactly where the 2-degree benchmark would set in. It's basically based on the sector weightings. This benchmark would allow to compare the CO2 intensity of a given public equity portfolio, i.e. its financed emissions per invested volume, with a 2-degree goal-aligned CO2 intensity. Now, what would be the use case in the end? Governments would be enabled to actually define meaningful target values for future regulations. Financial institutions would have the opportunity to a certain extent internalize climate-related externalities, and customers would gain much more transparency about the true impact of their investments. So the long-term goal would actually be to enable green or climate-friendly investment by default and not by choice. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Well done, Mark. Stephan, you want to start?
Thank you. Thank you. Very, very clear. I guess I have two questions. One is, what are the disincentives for global investment capital to prefer low emission, or in your words, 2% warming capped investment or investment vehicles? Because it seems to me that there's already a wall of money that has relatively little friction to do exactly what you describe. Mm-hmm. And then the second, slightly more technical question is, isn't this what organizations like Ceres, spelled with a C, has been propagating for a decade and a half, more or less?
Mm-hmm. So first on the...
In other words, how disruptive is it really?
Yeah, sure. So let me answer the first question first. Why it hasn't really been implemented, or why there's the need for better linking the investor with global climate goals, is that also this is already not a new idea. I mean, we've seen it with carbon trading schemes and things like that, but we see that there hasn't been an effective way yet to truly to link the system. I mean, the basic idea behind this is to put a price tag on carbon that actually is included, which is not just a side product, but that actually is engraved in the investment decisions and risk management of banks. So that's why my final statement was that it shouldn't be a choice, but actually profit maximization and green or climate-friendly investment should, in the best case, be aligned. And then, do you want to add on that? Or?
Well, the other thing I'm slightly confused about is my understanding is that global warming and the degrees, in your case 2 degrees, is what I think is called a lagging indicator. In other words, you can't make an investment in January and work out in March what the degree global warming amount by which that investment has caused or not caused anything. It takes, I don't know, you probably know this answer, but I think it's 2 years before you have any sense of what that lagging indicator looks like. So how does that work?
That's a very, very good point, which I definitely have to specify. It's basically, it's definitely a backward-looking indicator, and also a very, very high-level indicator. So if you really want to choose a company that you want to invest in, you would actually have to complement this indicator with additional forward-looking indicators, where you, for example, look at the technology exposure of a company or the strategy of a company, where you will be in the end. But my basic idea was to really get the connection between the political goal and the investment decision. So at the end of the year, you can say, okay, have we reached the target or not? And then you can decide, and then you have to use the new metrics to decide where you want to go.
But then you have, sorry, I promise this is the last, I promise this is my last question. But then you have a monstrously big problem of disaggregation. So how do you know whether it was investment X or investment Y that had a positive or negative? I mean, because these investments are bundled. So my guess is it would be absolutely impossible to create any, let alone correlation.
That's very true. So that's why, again, it's really a very high-level indicator. And to a certain extent, it really is supposed to link. And then, I mean, there are ways already where you can calculate the financed emissions, or you have like the ownership share of, when you invest into a company, a certain share of those CO2 emissions are yours, by the way, are your financed emissions. This is still not very standardized, but there are already, the methodology is already out there. So there are ways to allocate those emissions to the actual asset owner. Yeah.
Right. Let me let Robyn get in first, and then get to you, Thebe.
So I think that the goal that you say, you know, having a convergence of climate-friendly policies and, you know, profit maximization, that sounds really good on paper, but a lot of ideas have been tried and are in use already. Green bonds, you know, of course, carbon trading, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I'm a bit confused for why you think this idea is going to work better and be the solution to this problem.
Mm-hmm. I think this might be a better or potentially better solution because it is being used already out there. So it started with companies in the utilities, and also we're at Lafarge-Holcim this morning, that are already measuring their CO2 emissions. So it's not something entirely new that some politician came up with and just introduced it to the economic system, but you have the social pressure already, and then also companies see the value of looking at their carbon footprint. And so basically from the investee side, you already have this information. And now why it would work, or why I think it might work better, because, and also that actually kind of answers or touches your second question also, how this is new, because there are already other approaches that try to link your investments to 2-degree to the 2-degree goal. But to the best of my knowledge, there's no methodology out there yet that actually links those the financed CO2 emissions, or that actually creates a benchmark for those financed CO2 emissions. And I think it's a rather simple idea, but also cost-effective. So I think actually the implementation of it could also be used not by just the big banks, but also by smaller asset owners. Does that answer the question?
So Trump will say fake news, because he's going to say that next week, Wednesday, or whenever date it is, he's going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. So how are you going to operate if the biggest nation or the biggest economy in the world say that they don't support your idea because your idea exists in a figment of your academic mind?
Sure, that's a very good point. But also what I've been asked in the last couple of months as well is basically, I think there's big momentum right now. I mean, it would be a big step back if the USA would actually pull back from the Paris Agreement, but you have China and India for them, or especially for China as well. It's like pollution is such a political topic as well that they, of course, they probably don't just work on the topic because they suddenly are environmentally friendly, but it's actually really a political issue where they need to work on the environment, and that's why I also would push this topic forward. So I think, yeah, that's basically it.
Marcus, I think you're pushing the topic forward because you want the financial services industry to make more money. Because I think the only people who are going to get rich out of this is the financial service industry. Do you agree?
Which is basically the main proposition.
The main objective.
That's a win-win situation. The environment or the climate wins, and the
banks make money. So you agree that you've actually failed in dealing with the problem, because shouldn't the problem actually be trying to help the ordinary citizen understand the impact of their everyday decisions, rather than to try and force it down through legislation, policy, and financial incentives for the big business?
That's, again, pretty much the core of the idea. It's actually taking away, okay, you could say this is just top-down approach, but it's basically trying to make decisions easier by just combining profit maximization and green investment. It's like, I know that going to H&M is not the best solution. I'm aware of that, but I still go there because it's a cheaper option. But if you take away the cheaper option, or the cheaper option also at the same time is the best option, then I think that's the win-win situation that I'm aiming at.
Fake news, Marcus.
We'll let you get
convince
your
you.
feedback in, Marcus, there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And last but not least, number 6.
My name's Nat Ware. I'm originally from Sydney, Australia, but at the moment I'm based in the UK at Oxford, where I'm doing a PhD focused on microinsurance. When I'm not doing my PhD, I spend a lot of time doing volunteer consulting work for non-profit organisations, helping them to implement their disruptive ideas. What makes disruptive ideas successful is bringing together all the key stakeholders and ensuring that the incentives of all those different stakeholders are aligned in a mutually beneficial way. In the past, disruption was the exception. I think now disruption is the norm. And we need to ensure that the disruptions that we see are actually beneficial. We want to make sure that social and financial returns are aligned.
As we all know, millions of refugees are being resettled all across Europe. They need access to services such as education and training to enable them to gain employment and achieve their potential. But governments are under political pressure to not spend too much taxpayer money on refugees. We don't currently have a way to finance high-quality services to refugees at scale. It's a seemingly intractable problem. But what if I was to tell you that there's a way to finance services that doesn't cost the recipients anything, doesn't cost governments any money, doesn't rely on donations, and makes a profit for investors? It sounds too good to be true. I, at least, don't think it is. Tradable income-based securities, or TIBs, is a new type of public-private partnership. Here's the idea in brief. Governments award contracts to investors to provide services, such as vocational training to consenting individuals. These services, by their nature, increase expected lifetime incomes and therefore government tax revenue. Governments agree to pass on a portion of that tax revenue to investors. By way of example, I recently met Adam, a resettled refugee. He wanted to be a plumber but had no money and no training. With TIBs, the government could award a contract to provide 2 years of plumbing training to 1,000 refugees like Adam in return for 20% of the lifetime tax revenue attributable to them. Such an arrangement is mutually beneficial. Individuals receive access to services at no additional cost. They just pay the usual tax rate. So rather than other taxpayers paying for refugees, refugees are effectively paying for their own investments with their future tax money. Governments pay nothing up front, and there are ways of structuring the contract so they only pass on in the future what they otherwise would not have had. Investors can have a huge social impact without needing to reduce or share profit. Because the securities are tradable, investors can profit in the short term with uncapped upside. With TIBs, there's no trade-off between social and financial returns. Investors are incentivized to provide the highest quality services because what maximizes social impact is also what maximizes profit. A true win-win. This new type of public-private partnership can help millions of refugees. But more than that, it can also help the millions who will become unemployed and need retraining due to automation and deindustrialization. This is a way to finance that retraining at scale. I've loved listening to all the great ideas here tonight. We've heard a lot of great ideas. A key theme has been, how do we get these stakeholders to work in the interests of disadvantaged people? We heard some great ideas about how government can do that, how investors might be able to do that, and how we can increase empathy in disadvantaged individuals. What I've attempted to do with this idea of TIBs is to bring those stakeholders together, to align their incentives, to leverage their different strengths, to work with the system we already have. Why did I come up with this idea? It's because there are millions of people in need. But what annoys me is that there are thousands of great ideas out there for how to help them. Coding courses, language lessons, hospitality training. But many of those great ideas never happen because they don't have a viable financing mechanism. What I've tried to do is create that missing link. This is one idea that can potentially make thousands of great ideas become reality.
Ned, I have no clue why you're picking up on the poor refugees. Don't the citizens also need services from government?
I think there's a lot of demand for services. I think the greatest demand is among the disadvantaged populations that I talked about, refugees, also indigenous populations. I think that's another group that is desperately in need of high quality services. But the unemployed as well, which is going to increase as a problem over the next decade. But certainly this is a financing model that may in the future be able to be applied more generally. But I think the first place I want to start is where there is the greatest need. And I think at this point in time, refugees, indigenous populations, and those who are becoming unemployed, that's the place to start.
So let's stick with those two. Let's stick with the refugees and the indigenous populations of where you come from, Australia, the Aborigines. So those two people, once a businessman comes and says, I'm going to invest in services among refugees and among the Aborigines, they are never in their lifetime or certainly in the short term going to be able to generate returns on that investment. Because most refugees do not even get an opportunity to be able to work and then pay tax, and then that tax becomes the way in which the businessman is going to make money. So this idea of yours is never going to work, Nat. You know yourself. There's no money that's going to be made out of this.
So that's precisely the problem that I try to solve. The fact that these returns are well into the future, in 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And the problem there is that the pitch to governments isn't very strong. At the moment, if governments spend money, they're spending money in the 3 years that they care about before the next election. And the financial returns in higher tax are in 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And so governments aren't incentivized to do it. What I'm able to do with tradable income-based securities is transfer that risk from the government to the private sector. But because the private sector can sell the right to the securities, the right to that stream of payments from the government after they finish providing the services, it means that those long-term financial returns can be brought to the present, and actually investors can profit in the short term based on those long-term, based on the long-term financial increase in tax revenue that we'll see in 10, 20, 30, 40 years from those investments.
That's what I worry. That's what I worry. Actually, I worry on two levels. On the one level, let's talk about a flavor of the month, Trump. So he comes into government for his 4 years, and then he says, I'm going to reverse that policy. I'm not interested in that policy. So the poor investor who's put in the money and was expecting a return is actually never going to get his money because the policy has been reversed. That's just on the one side. But what I really worry about, is that you are just out here to make the businessman richer at the expense of public goods. Because the businessman is really just going to be focused on extracting returns as quick and as much as they can. Isn't that the orientation of a business person?
So I'll deal with both of those issues. First issue, can sovereign states who contract, can those contracts be enforced? There's a lot of precedents where governments can sign contracts and those contracts enforced, particularly in an environment where those states are long-term, where they do multiple contracts, particularly where there's separation of powers and the court system can hold the executive to account. There's also a precedent, Argentina versus Elliott, where the Argentinian government was actually made to enforce a contract that was on the basis of claiming stranded assets that the Argentinian government owned elsewhere in the world. So there's various ways of enforcing contracts. But on the issue of will this just make people rich? I don't have a problem with making people rich if it also achieves social outcomes. And for example, if you're providing language lessons to refugees, and if the market decides that this will increase the employment prospects of refugees and actually enable them to get a job, and if the government contracts with an investor to provide high-quality German language training, I'm not sure what the investor could do that would be perverse incentives in that instance. And I'm fine with the investor making money if the individual benefits without having to pay anything, and if the government only passes on in the future what they otherwise would not have had.
Operative if. Because you know the investor is going to try and take the shortest cut, isn't it? But I guess my other question to you linked to that is, so in your world, governments are now out of business? Because I thought their primary business to start with was to look out for those very communities who cannot look after themselves.
First of all, this certainly will not replace governments at all. This is aimed at solving particular problems where there are investments that can increase, investments in human capital that can increase expected lifetime incomes, and where those investments can't currently being made based on financial instruments. But there is a role for the government here. It's not getting away from the role of the government. I'm just changing the role of the government. I'm changing them from being a direct provider where the incentives are not there. Economically and politically, the incentives aren't there for governments to have high-level investments in these disadvantaged populations. What I'm changing is the role of government in that instance from being a direct provider to almost a conduit. They're a facilitator of that interaction. So they're passing on the tax revenue. And the reason why they're doing that is because private investors don't know the incomes, don't know the taxation revenue, and can't enforce that as easily as governments can. So I'm tapping into the different strengths and characteristics of the different stakeholders.
All right, so a question from Robyn?
Yeah, so the basic innovation is you're securitizing something far in the future. Tell us what's been done like this before and whether it's worked. In your case, you're trying to securitize something that you think would be a public good. And a lot of securitization doesn't tackle public goods, but securitization is not a new idea.
So this idea is different in many ways. Probably the closest thing to it is social impact bonds, but despite having similar acronyms, there's major differences between the two. 5 major differences with social impact bonds. One, the order of the financial flows. So in social impact bonds, governments often need to pay within a short period of time, normally about 5 years based on. And again, those governments only get that financial return well into the future. It's the opposite in the case of tradable income-based securities. Governments receive money up front, as I explained in the essay, and they only pay in the future, and there's ways of structuring it such that they only pay if it's more effective than the counterfactual investment. So the government proposition is the opposite in the case of tradable income-based securities to SIPs. In terms of the investor proposition, investors in the case of social impact bonds, often it's a capped payout, and often it's at one point in time, so that return can only be realized on a specific date. I changed that so that there's uncapped upside and it can be realized at any point in time that the investor wants. In terms of the effectiveness, which is another key point of difference, in social impact bonds, you can't actually know, the government doesn't know which provider is the most effective. Essentially, they're guessing who to provide it to. One other innovation in my model is that the most effective investor will be the one that wins the contract. And the reason why is because the most effective investor is the one that expects to be able to increase lifetime incomes by the most, and therefore taxation revenue, and therefore the price of tips. And so they're going to bid the highest if there's an auction for the contract. So the sort of revelation of effectiveness, I could go on about effort and the cost of measurement and the interdependency of social outcomes, but I'm sure you've got more questions to ask.
I've got Stephan waiting with one, I hope.
Well, I mean, first of all, I really like this idea. It works with the grain of a set of things that we know quite a lot about, you know, incentives and how to value future cash flows and the effect of bringing people into the tax code and productive work and so on. My question is from the investor perspective. It's hard enough valuing the future. It's even harder if there is a significant extra element, which let's call it volatility. Let's call it the effect on the future tax code of future and probably largely difficult to anticipate things. How much do you think that pricing that volatility in turns this into from a marginally good to a probably not good idea?
Sure, it's a great question. I'd say a couple of things on that. Firstly, there are certainly minor adjustments or tweaks that can be made to the model if that is a major concern. You can contract on the basis of income, which disincentivizes governments from changing the taxation rate.
But it's more like a SIB. More like a social impact bond.
There are still major differences there that I'm happy to go into. So that's sort of the first difference. Secondly, in terms of the risk to investors, as with any new product, initially there is going to be risk. I'd certainly say that there's a lot of data out there about different interventions, such as education, and how that affects lifetime income. And there's more data on that than most other things. But secondly, that's far more predictable than a lot of investments. If you're a VC doing startup investment, you're trying to guess the profitability of certain firms. based on sort of, you have a whole pool of data, historical data on jobs and employment and returns. And so I think that there is always going to be an element of risk that will be priced into the security, but I think that risk is lower than in many other types of investments.
But as Thebe said, I can't now remember the exact number, but it's something really, really scary. Refugees live outside their country for, someone's going to know this number, 16, 17 years on average. So your investment horizon is very long here, plus the added volatility.
So I'm glad you asked that, because that's also an important issue. On the issue of sort of living in the country, first of all, again, sort of, there are lots of different tweaks that you can do. You can reduce the time horizon and increase the percentage. So rather than it being lifetime 20%, it can be 10 years, 40%, 5 years, 60%. There's a lot of easy tweaks and variations to reduce that time horizon. But in terms of living in a country, most of the refugees in Europe are from Syria. 99% of those get approved. They're not going back anytime soon. Indigenous populations have incredibly low migration rates. People who have lost their jobs to automation but have lived in the same town for 40 years. And there's no extra incentive to leave a country as a result of this mechanism because they're not paying anything extra. But insofar as that is an issue, again, it just gets incorporated into the price of the security. And again, there are various adjustments and tweaks that can be made, making it conditional on being in a place for a certain time, having the contract convert to micro-equity arrangements or loan arrangements, in conditional on certain events occurring. But in terms of, I don't see that as a major issue for those reasons.
But you do have one issue. Quick question. How are you going to, let's forget the refugees, and let's forget our Greek friends who don't want to pay tax. How are you going to get the rest of the people to pay tax? Because governments are already struggling to get as much tax as they can. And then you look at a country like the US, which last week Trump proposed his new tax idea, reducing corporate tax, reducing personal tax. So in other words, very little money that's going to come into the state coffers. So your idea is going to fail.
So there's two sort of issues there. One is on sort of, I think that in terms of sort of the volatility or the uncertainty, again, that is something that the market, and it goes both ways, right? It can increase, it can decrease, it can change. The government isn't incentivized either way, and the market will price in the likelihood of each of those two scenarios. But I think the key thing here is sort of trying to bring those stakeholders together in a new way. And the fact is, governments at the moment are not in a position, either politically or economically, to make the investments that are necessary. And it's about bringing those stakeholders together in a way that enables it to happen.
No, thank you very much. That was Thebe disrupting our schedule, though, by the way, with that last question. I want to thank our panel here for their contribution as well. I know you were quite tough on the guys, but thank you very much, all 6 finalists. Big round of applause, please.